The morning mist clung to the grass runway at RAF Northolt, west of London, on September 7, 1940. Flight Lieutenant Charles Pemberton stood in the dispersal hut doorway, watching the ground crew prepare his aircraft for the day's operations. The Spitfire Mark I sat on the hardstand, its elegant elliptical wings and streamlined fuselage making it one of the most beautiful aircraft ever built. But beauty meant nothing if the engine didn't work properly, and Pemberton's engine had become the subject of considerable mockery among his squadron mates. The problem was simple. His Spitfire still had the original Rolls-Royce Merlin II engine, the first production variant that had powered the initial batch of Spitfires delivered to the RAF in 1938. By September 1940, most squadrons had received Spitfires with the improved Merlin XII engine, which produced more power, had better altitude performance, and was generally more reliable. But aircraft production was chaotic during the Battle of Britain, and some squadrons were forced to make do with older aircraft. Pemberton's 72 Squadron had a mix of old and new Spitfires, and through bad luck or bureaucratic oversight, Pemberton had been stuck with one of the oldest aircraft in the squadron. The other pilots never missed an opportunity to comment on it. "Still flying that antique, Pemberton?" Squadron leader Davies had said just yesterday. "I'm surprised it gets off the ground. The Merlin II was obsolete before the war even started." Flying Officer Thompson had been more direct. "That engine belongs in a museum, not in combat. You're going to get yourself killed trying to keep up with the rest of us." Even the ground crew seemed apologetic about it. Sergeant Harris, the chief mechanic, had pulled Pemberton aside 3 days earlier and said, "Sir, I've put in another request for a replacement aircraft. That Merlin II just doesn't have the performance of the newer models. At altitude, you'll be giving away 50 horsepower to the Jerrys. That could be the difference between life and death." Pemberton understood their concerns, shared them even, but he also understood that aircraft were in desperately short supply. The Battle of Britain had been raging since July, and Fighter Command was losing aircraft faster than factories could replace them. Every pilot who could fly did fly, and you flew whatever aircraft was available. Complaining about having an older model seemed ungrateful when some pilots were flying Hurricanes that were even slower than his Spitfire. Charles Pemberton was 24 years old, a career RAF officer who had joined the service in 1936, straight out of university. He had been flying fighters for 3 years, first on Gloucester Gladiator biplanes, then transitioning to Spitfires in early 1939. He had 5 confirmed kills since the battle began, a respectable score, but nothing extraordinary. He was not one of the glamorous aces whose exploits filled the newspapers, just a competent professional pilot doing his job. His job on this particular morning was to participate in yet another scramble to intercept German bombers heading for London. The pattern had become grimly routine. Radar would detect incoming raids, Fighter Command would vector squadrons to intercept, and young men would die in the sky over southern England. Some days the RAF won, shooting down more Germans than they lost. Some days the Germans won. Most days it was too close to call, both sides bleeding aircraft and pilots in an attritional struggle that seemed to have no end. The telephone in the dispersal hut rang at 10:47 a.m. The duty officer grabbed it, listened for a moment, then shouted the words every pilot had been waiting for. "Scramble, scramble, large raid forming over Calais, heading for London, all aircraft up." Pemberton sprinted for his Spitfire, his Mae West life jacket flapping, his parachute pack bouncing on his back. He reached the aircraft as the ground crew were pulling the wheel chocks, vaulted onto the wing, and dropped into the cockpit with practiced ease. His hands moved automatically through the startup sequence, every switch and lever memorized through hundreds of hours of flight time. The Merlin II engine coughed, sputtered, and then caught with a roar that shook the entire airframe. Pemberton let it warm up for 15 seconds, watching the oil pressure climb, then released the brakes and taxied toward the runway. 11 other Spitfires were doing the same, the squadron forming a loose gaggle as they took off in pairs. Pemberton's takeoff was smooth, the Spitfire lifting off cleanly and climbing away from the airfield. The Merlin II engine ran rough for a moment at full power, a characteristic that had worried him initially, but that Sergeant Harris assured him was normal for this model. The roughness smoothed out as he gained altitude, the engine settling into its operating rhythm. The squadron assembled at 5,000 feet and set course for the Thames estuary, climbing as they flew. Squadron leader Davies's voice came over the radio, calm and professional despite the static. All Redcap aircraft, Vector 090, climbed to 20,000 feet. Bandits reported at Angels 25, numerous. Stay together and watch for fighters. 25,000 feet. That was higher than Pemberton had ever fought before. Most engagements during the Battle of Britain happened between 15 and 20,000 feet, where the Spitfire's performance was excellent. But 25,000 feet was entering the realm where the air was thin, where engines struggled, where the Merlin II's limitations would become glaringly apparent. The climb seemed to take forever. Pemberton watched his altimeter wind up slowly, 8,000 feet, 10,000, 12,000. Around him, the other Spitfires climbed in a loose formation, their Merlin XII engines pulling them upward with steady power. Pemberton's Merlin II was working hard, the manifold pressure gauge showing maximum boost, the temperature climbing toward the high end of the acceptable range. At 15,000 feet, he could feel the difference. His aircraft was laboring now, the rate of climb decreasing noticeably. The other Spitfires were pulling ahead, their newer engines maintaining better performance at altitude. By 18,000 feet, Pemberton was definitely falling behind. His engine was still running, still producing power, but not enough. The air at this altitude was thin, containing less oxygen, and the Merlin II's single-stage supercharger couldn't force enough air into the engine to maintain sea-level power. The result was a steady degradation of performance as altitude increased. Squadron leader Davies noticed. His voice came over the radio, irritated. "Redcap 5, this is Redcap leader. Can you maintain formation?" Pemberton was Redcap 5. He glanced at his instruments, seeing the rate of climb indicator showing barely 500 feet per minute, half of what it should be. "Redcap leader, Redcap 5. Negative, sir. Engine performance degrading at altitude." There was a pause, then Davies's voice, resigned. "Understood, Redcap 5. Fall back and maintain patrol at Angels 20. The rest of you, continue climb to Angels 25. It was a dismissal, a polite way of saying that Pemberton's obsolete engine made him a liability at high altitude, that he should stay out of the way while the real fighters did the work. Pemberton felt his face burn with shame as he throttled back and leveled off at 20,000 feet, watching the rest of his squadron continue climbing without him. He was alone now, separated from his squadron, orbiting over the Thames estuary at 20,000 feet like a forgotten piece of equipment. The radio chatter increased as the squadron made contact with the German formation. Pemberton listened to the calls, piecing together the tactical picture. The Germans had sent over a massive raid, perhaps 200 bombers escorted by fighters at various altitudes. The RAF had scrambled every available squadron, and the sky over London was about to become a battleground. Tally-ho, Dornier bombers, Angels 25, heading 320. Messerschmitts high, 6 of them, diving from Angels 30. Break right, you've got one on your tail." The professional calm of the earlier radio calls disintegrated into the controlled chaos of combat. Pemberton orbited at his assigned altitude, feeling useless, listening to his squadron mates fighting and dying while he sat below them because his engine was too old to keep up. Then he saw them. High above, much higher than the main bomber formation, a group of aircraft were circling at what Pemberton estimated was 35,000 feet, maybe higher. They were barely visible, tiny specks against the blue sky, but something about their behavior caught his attention. They weren't engaging, weren't diving down to join the battle below. They were just circling, waiting, watching. It took Pemberton a moment to realize what he was seeing. A top cover flight, German fighters positioned at extreme altitude to pounce on any Allied fighters that climbed too high or became separated from their formations. It was a classic tactic, using altitude advantage to control the battle, diving on isolated targets with the speed advantage that altitude provided. The Germans up there were probably in Messerschmitt Bf 109Es, possibly the newer F model, both capable of operating effectively above 30,000 feet. No Spitfire could reach them. The Merlin XII engine started to lose power above 25,000 feet, and by 30,000 feet, a Spitfire was wallowing, barely able to maintain altitude. Those German fighters were invulnerable, untouchable, free to dive on targets of their choosing. Except Pemberton wasn't at 25,000 feet. He was at 20,000, and his engine, for all its limitations, still had some performance left. An idea formed in his mind, an idea that was probably stupid, possibly suicidal, but that might just work. The Merlin II engine had limitations at high altitude, yes, but it also had one characteristic that the newer Merlin XII didn't have. It had been designed with a different supercharger gear ratio, optimized for a different altitude band. The Merlin XIII was better at medium altitudes, but the Merlin II, with its older supercharger design, actually held its power better at extreme altitudes. It was a quirk of engineering, a side effect of using an older design, and it meant that while Pemberton's aircraft was slower than the others at 20,000 feet, it might actually perform better than them at 35,000 feet. It was a long shot, but Pemberton had nothing to lose. He was already out of the main fight, already relegated to useless patrol duty. He pushed the throttle forward and pulled back on the control column, pointing the Spitfire's nose at the sky and beginning to climb. The Merlin II engine responded, the needle on the manifold pressure gauge quivering but holding steady. Pemberton adjusted the mixture control, leaning it out slightly to account for the thinner air, and watched his altimeter begin to wind up again. 22,000 feet. 24,000. The rate of climb was decreasing rapidly now, the aircraft struggling in the thin air. At 26,000 feet, he was climbing at barely 300 feet per minute. A crawl compared to the thousands of feet per minute he could achieve at sea level. But he was still climbing, and the German fighters above still hadn't noticed him. They were focused on the battle below, looking down not up, and his solitary Spitfire was probably too small to catch their attention. 28,000 feet. The engine was running rough again, the thin air causing it to stumble occasionally. Pemberton adjusted the mixture again, fine-tuning it, coaxing every possible bit of performance from the elderly engine. The cockpit was bitterly cold at this altitude, the thin air providing little insulation, and ice was forming on the inside of his canopy. He could see his breath, great clouds of vapor that fogged his oxygen mask. 30,000 feet. This was the highest Pemberton had ever flown. At this altitude, the Spitfire felt mushy, unresponsive, balanced on the edge of a stall. The slightest misjudgment would send it tumbling out of the sky. But the engine was still running, still producing power, and he was still climbing. 32,000 feet. He could see the German fighters clearly now, about 3,000 feet above him. There were 4 of them, Messerschmitt Bf-109s in a loose finger 4 formation. They were circling lazily, conserving fuel, waiting for targets below. One of them had distinctive yellow markings on the nose and tail, probably a flight leader or a pilot with significant experience. 34,000 feet. Pemberton's rate of climb was down to barely 100 feet per minute. The engine was laboring, the propeller barely biting the thin air, but it was still climbing. Around him the sky had taken on a deep purple hue, the upper atmosphere visible in a way it never was at lower altitudes. The curvature of the Earth was visible on the horizon. It was beautiful and deadly. 35,000 feet. The German fighters were at his altitude now, perhaps 500 meters ahead, and slightly to his right. They still hadn't seen him, their attention focused downward on the battle raging below. Pemberton was breathing pure oxygen through his mask, the thin air at this altitude insufficient to sustain life. His instruments showed that his engine was operating at the very edge of its capabilities, temperature gauges in the red, oil pressure fluctuating. If the engine failed now, he would glide down and probably make it home, but he would have accomplished nothing. He had come this far, he might as well finish it. 36,000 feet. Now he was above the German fighters, exactly the position they had been using to dominate the battle. The altitude advantage was his, and with it came the potential energy to convert into speed. He rolled the Spitfire inverted, a maneuver that felt terrifyingly sluggish in the thin air, and pulled the nose down into a dive. Gravity took over where the engine could not. The Spitfire accelerated rapidly, falling out of the sky like a stone, the airspeed indicator winding up quickly. 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The controls were stiffening as the airspeed increased, the aircraft buffeting slightly. Pemberton aimed for the distinctive yellow-marked BF-109, the one he guessed was the flight leader. At this speed, closing from directly above, he would be on them in seconds. The German pilot still hadn't seen him, hadn't expected a threat from above, because no British fighter should have been able to climb this high. At 400 yards, Pemberton squeezed the firing button on his control column. 8 303 machine guns roared to life, the Spitfire shuddering with recoil. The tracer rounds reached out, initially falling short, then walking up toward the yellow-marked BF-109 as Pemberton corrected his aim. At 300 yards, the tracers began hitting. He saw pieces fly off the Messerschmitt's wing and fuselage. The German fighter rolled violently left, the pilot finally realizing he was under attack. But he was too late. Pemberton held the trigger down, riding the recoil, walking his fire across the BF-109's fuselage and into the cockpit area. The Messerschmitt's canopy shattered, smoke began streaming from the engine, and the aircraft nosed over into a vertical dive. Pemberton released the trigger and pulled up hard, fighting the G-forces and the thin air. His vision tunneled, going grey at the edges, but he held the pull until the Spitfire came level. He looked around frantically, knowing the other German fighters would be reacting now. He saw 2 of them diving away, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor. The 4th was turning toward him, trying to bring his guns to bear. But Pemberton had altitude advantage and speed from his dive. He pointed his nose at the turning BF-109 and dove again. The German pilot saw him coming and tried to turn harder, but at this altitude, the thin air made hard maneuvers nearly impossible. The BF-109 wallowed through the turn, bleeding speed, losing energy. Pemberton closed to 200 yards and fired another burst. This one was more carefully aimed, a 3-second burst that concentrated on the Messerschmitt's engine. The Merlin engine was famous for its reliability, but German engines had their own strengths. The Daimler-Benz DB601 that powered the BF-109 was a fine engine, powerful and well-designed. But it had one weakness: it used direct fuel injection, which meant that in extreme maneuvers, fuel flow could be interrupted. Pemberton's burst hit the BF-109's engine cowling and damaged something critical, probably the fuel lines or the injection system. The German engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Without power, at 35,000 feet, where the air was too thin to glide efficiently, the BF-109 was done. The pilot rolled inverted and bailed out immediately, his parachute snapping open far above the clouds below. Pemberton didn't watch him fall. He was scanning for the other 2 Messerschmitts, but they were gone, fled down to lower altitudes where their engines could breathe properly. He was alone at 36,000 feet, the highest point in the sky, master of the vertical battlefield. His fuel gauge showed he was running low, the long climb having consumed more than he had planned. Time to go home. The descent was strange, almost surreal. Pemberton throttled back and let the Spitfire sink gently, falling through layers of air that grew progressively thicker and warmer. At 30,000 feet, his engine began running smoothly again, the increased air density allowing it to operate normally. At 25,000 feet, he could feel the controls becoming more responsive, the aircraft coming back to life. At 20,000 feet, he leveled off briefly and looked around. Below him, the great air battle was winding down. Smoke trails marked where aircraft had fallen, both British and German. The German bombers were turning back, their formations broken by the RAF's defense. Some were trailing smoke, damaged by fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Others were dropping their bombs early just to reduce weight for the flight home. London had been saved again, for today at least, though tomorrow the Germans would come back and the whole deadly process would repeat. Pemberton landed at Northolt 40 minutes after taking off, taxiing to his dispersal area with an engine that was running rough again but still functioning. When he shut down and climbed out of the cockpit, he found Sergeant Harris waiting with a concerned expression. "Sir, the engine temperature was well into the red when you landed. What happened up there?" "I took it to 36,000 feet, Sergeant." Harris's eyes widened. 36? In a Merlin II? That's impossible, sir. The engine shouldn't be able to maintain power above 30,000. It was difficult, Pemberton admitted, but it held together, and I got 2 Messerschmitts that were providing top cover for the German formation. The other pilots of 72 Squadron were landing now, their Spitfires touching down one by one. When Squadron leader Davies climbed out of his aircraft and heard about Pemberton's engagement, his expression was skeptical. "You're claiming 2 kills at 36,000 feet. In that old Merlin II?" "Yes, sir," both confirmed. One pilot bailed out, the other aircraft went down out of control. Davies looked at him for a long moment, then turned to Flying Officer Thompson, who had been flying nearby during the engagement. "Thompson, did you see any of this?" Thompson nodded slowly. "I saw someone high above us, much higher, engaging aircraft that we couldn't reach. Didn't realize it was Pemberton until now. I assumed it was one of the newer squadrons with the latest Spitfires. But if he says it was him, I believe it. I saw 2 Messerschmitts go down from up there." The intelligence officer arrived to debrief the pilots, and Pemberton gave his account of the engagement. The climb to extreme altitude, the diving attack, the 2 kills. The intelligence officer made notes, asked questions, and seemed particularly interested in the engine performance. "Flight Lieutenant, this is quite remarkable. We've been under the impression that the Merlin II couldn't operate effectively above 28,000 feet. You're saying you climbed to 36,000 and conducted combat operations?" "Yes, sir. The engine was running at its absolute limits, and I wouldn't want to try it regularly, but it was possible. I think the older supercharger design actually works better at extreme altitude than the newer model." The intelligence officer made more notes. "This could be important information. We've been assuming the Germans have an insurmountable altitude advantage with their high-altitude patrols. If even our older Spitfires can reach them, that changes the tactical picture." Over the next few days, Pemberton's combat report worked its way up the chain of command, eventually reaching the desk of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the commander of Fighter Command. Dowding sent a team of engineers from Rolls-Royce to interview Pemberton and examine his aircraft. The engineers were fascinated. They explained that the Merlin II's supercharger had been designed early in the engine's development, before the full altitude requirements were understood. The Merlin XII had been optimized for the 15 to 25,000 foot altitude band where most combat occurred, which improved performance there but actually reduced performance at extreme altitudes. The Merlin II, with its cruder but differently geared supercharger, maintained power better above 30,000 feet. It was an unintended side effect of using an older design. "It's actually quite fortunate," one of the engineers said. "We've been developing a 2-stage supercharger system for high-altitude performance, but it won't be ready until next year. In the meantime, your discovery means we can use the older Merlin II-equipped aircraft for high-altitude intercepts. They're actually better suited for that role than the newer models." The mockery stopped after that. The pilots who had made fun of Pemberton's antique engine now understood that it had capabilities the newer engines lacked. Flying Officer Thompson apologized directly. "I was wrong about your engine, Pemberton. I thought it was a liability. Turns out it was an asset. We just didn't know how to use it properly." Squadron leader Davies was more pragmatic. "Pemberton, I'm assigning you to high-altitude patrol duty. When we get reports of German fighters at extreme altitude, you'll be the one to go after them. Your aircraft is apparently better suited for that role than the rest of ours." Over the next month, Pemberton flew repeated high-altitude missions, climbing to 35,000 feet or higher to engage German top cover flights that other British fighters couldn't reach. He shot down 3 more Messerschmitts in these engagements, becoming something of a specialist in extreme altitude combat. His Merlin II engine became famous in its own way. Engineers visited from multiple squadrons to study it, to understand how Pemberton coaxed performance from it that shouldn't have been possible. Sergeant Harris became expert at tuning the engine for high-altitude work, adjusting mixture settings and ignition timing to optimize performance in the thin air above 30,000 feet. By October 1940, several other squadrons had identified their oldest Spitfires, the ones still equipped with Merlin II engines, and had assigned them specifically to high-altitude patrol duties. What had been considered obsolete equipment became valued for its unintended capabilities. The Battle of Britain officially ended on October 31, 1940, with the RAF having successfully defended Britain from German air attack. Pemberton had flown throughout the battle, his total score reaching 11 confirmed kills, 6 of them at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where no other British fighter could operate effectively. His obsolete engine had proven to be exactly what was needed for a role nobody had anticipated. In November, Rolls-Royce invited Pemberton to their facility in Derby to consult on high-altitude engine development. The engineers wanted to understand how he had pushed the Merlin XII beyond its supposed limits, what techniques he had used, what limitations he had encountered. Pemberton spent 3 days at the factory, flying test aircraft, comparing different engine variants, sharing his experiences. The chief engineer, a brilliant man named Hives, listened to Pemberton's accounts with great interest. "You know, Flight Lieutenant, we designers sometimes get so focused on optimizing for the expected use case that we forget to consider other possibilities. We designed the Merlin XII to be better than the Merlin II at medium altitudes, because that's where we expected combat to occur. We succeeded in that goal, but in the process, we made it worse at high altitude. Your combat experience has taught us that we need to maintain capability across a broader altitude range. The new 2-stage Merlin we're developing will be effective from sea level to 40,000 feet. Your work helped inform that design." Pemberton returned to his squadron in December, but by then the character of the air war had changed. The Germans had abandoned daylight raids and switched to night bombing, which required different tactics and different aircraft. Pemberton was posted to a training command in early 1941, where he taught new pilots about high-altitude combat, about engine management, about extracting maximum performance from their aircraft, regardless of model or age. The Spitfire with the Merlin II engine that had carried him through the Battle of Britain was eventually retired from service, replaced by newer models with better engines. But before it was scrapped, someone at the RAF Museum decided it should be preserved as an example of an early production Spitfire. It sits today in the museum's collection, its Merlin II engine still installed, a plaque explaining its unusual service history, and the pilot who proved that obsolete technology could still be valuable in the right circumstances. Charles Pemberton survived the war, eventually retiring from the RAF in 1946 with the rank of wing commander. He returned to civilian life, working as an aviation consultant, occasionally giving lectures about his experiences. When asked about the Battle of Britain and his high-altitude victories, he would always deflect credit to the engineers who built the aircraft and the ground crew who maintained it. "I just flew what they gave me," he would say. "Everyone was making fun of that old engine, saying it was obsolete, saying it would get me killed. But Sergeant Harris kept it running beautifully, and when the tactical situation required high-altitude capability, that supposedly obsolete engine turned out to be exactly what was needed. It taught me an important lesson. Don't dismiss something just because it's old or unfashionable. Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones, if you understand how to use them properly." The story of Pemberton's Merlin II engine became part of RAF lore, a reminder that perceived weaknesses can sometimes be strengths in disguise, that obsolete equipment might have valuable capabilities that newer designs lack. Aviation historians studying the Battle of Britain would note that the older Spitfires, the ones everyone wanted to replace, actually played a crucial role in countering German high-altitude tactics. The mockery those aircraft received was undeserved, based on assumptions about how air combat should work, rather than understanding how it actually worked. In the decades after the war, as aviation technology advanced rapidly, engineers and tacticians would sometimes reference Pemberton's experience as a cautionary tale. Don't assume that newer is always better. Don't optimize so narrowly that you lose capability in unexpected areas. And don't mock the old engine until you understand everything it can do. The lesson remains relevant today, in aviation and beyond. The tools we dismiss as obsolete might still have value, if only we're creative enough to find the right application for them.